The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me for this episode after week off last week is Will Miles. You can find him at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. Will, you're back.
Hey man, you let me have a week off. I'm glad that glad I was able to relax and certainly back to talk about some exciting stuff tonight.
Yeah, Connor O'Gara was our guest last week, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And that you and I have been talking, and we'll do a areas for improvement show coming up in a couple weeks or so. But I thought it was pretty interesting. As good as last year was, there are still areas for improvement. As I said, we'll get to that. But the first one there was, Gators got to improve in their own division.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what everybody expects to see. The losses to Kentucky and Missouri are going to be things that can't happen in year 2 and year 3 if Florida wants to get where the fans want them to go. But certainly, sometimes you have those hiccups early on, and a lot of times in year 2 and year 3, you see teams take. They may be better teams in year 2, but they don't necessarily perform quite as well. So it was interesting to see Connor's take on that, and yeah, I'm interested to see where the season goes this year.
All right. So as I said, a couple more weeks, Will and I will be looking at some areas for improvement for the Gators. But tonight we're going to take a look at some key Gators that will be instrumental in the 2019 season. But before we get there, remember you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes and also catch the podcast on Apple Podcast, Google Play, YouTube, and Spotify. When using those services, please go out there, share, rate, review the show, put some reviews out there on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all that good stuff, and follow us on social media as well on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So as I mentioned, this episode is about some key Gators that we'll be taking a look at, important Gators, some guys coming back from injury, some guys who really need to step up. And Will, I'm going to start at the position unit that has the biggest question mark. And you released an article that we'll get into later on. But the biggest question mark for the Gators, and of course, is offensive line. This player can be key because while it has been said many times that Florida has to replace 4 starters from last year's offensive line, he still brings a ton of experience to the offensive line, and that's Brett Heggie. While Florida is replacing 4 starters, I really think you can say 3, as Heggie would have been starting last season had he stayed healthy. So given the inexperience at left tackle, where it looks like Stone Forsythe and in his 3 starts will get the nod. Right guard where Chris Blake has no starts. Right tackle where Gene Delance has no starts. Heggie staying healthy, bringing back all the experience that he brings is really key to me. And it essentially means you're reducing the inexperience on the line and mainly starting experience there. So, Heggie started 7 games, played in 8 in 2017, where many of us viewed him as one of, if not the best offensive lineman the Gators had in McElwain's last season. He was a bright spot in an otherwise forgettable offensive line performance there. We were excited to see him get to work under John Hevesy. Still played in 9 games last season, but didn't start as he battled injuries throughout last season. And this was after he got injured versus Missouri in 2017. So he's got 17 games worth of experience, Will. Nick Buchanan at center, who played in and started 12 games last season there. So Heggie and Buchanan bring a ton of experience to this offensive line. And that does, that gets an offensive line that gets the tag of having to replace 4 starters. But that doesn't mean there isn't starting experience there. And really, it can be looked at as only replacing 3 starters because Heggie brings enough starting experience and overall experience to me.
Yeah, the injury bug I think has really been the thing that concerns people when it comes to Heggie is can he stay healthy? And it hasn't just been during the actual season. It's been, during spring practice or during fall camp. He hasn't necessarily been out there getting the reps that all the other guys have, particularly last year. And so you wonder, the SEC is a tough league, and Florida was pretty fortunate last year to basically have all 5 starters stay healthy all year long. You don't figure that's going to swing in the complete opposite direction, but you also figure that you're going to have a high ankle sprain or you're going to have a running back roll up on an offensive lineman at some point throughout the year. And so, the guys who have the experience, Buchanan and Heggie, are really the guys that you hope that doesn't happen to because they can anchor the middle of that line. And, last year, I think you would say that that Buchanan, Tyler Jordan, and Fred Johnson were probably the weaker links on the offensive line. You looked at Ivy at left tackle and Jawan Taylor at right tackle and said, there's your strength. I think this year you go into it saying Heggie and Buchanan side by side are really your strength just from an experience standpoint. And so, really, the offensive line is going to have that strength up the middle, which if you think about what happened the last 3 or 4 games where Felipe Franks was running a lot more up the middle, that's not necessarily a bad thing to have your strength at the guard and the center position, or at least your experience at the guard and the center position, particularly as you break in some of those tackles. So, obviously, anytime you've got an inexperienced offensive line, the guys who have experience are going to be important, and I think that's true for Heggie as well as Buchanan. I think those two guys sort of in tandem there on the left center of the line are going to play a big role, especially early on against Miami.
Yeah, and I would say he's key as also, I don't want to say he's key just because he's a healthy body out there. He's a good player. I mean, and it really changes the narrative that Florida only has experience coming back with Buchanan. Because while most Gator fans know this, when outsiders are looking at Florida and you hear all the time they got to replace 4 starters, they're just going to assume they're just not really places where there actually is experience and starting experience. So, not to mention Heggie is a really good guard when he's out there. He's got some nice pulling ability and has a mean streak in him that John Hevesy likes. So by him being out there, that may keep you from having to throw, say, Ethan White or William Harrah before they're ready out there. So, I have confidence in John Hevesy getting the most out of his offensive line. We'll get into that later on, and him dealing with the inexperience out there. But Heggie will bring some continuity, and if healthy, will keep the offensive line from being so inexperienced. Keeps that left side solidified, Frank's blind side solidified with some experience out there. And Will, I know just putting out there, there's another offensive lineman that you got an eye on for a key season this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I want to add to what you said there. Obviously, Heggie has been a good player when he's been out there, and you don't necessarily want to undersell that. The other thing is that when you actually look at the number of games these guys have played in, so Stone Forsyth, he played in 15 games overall in his career. Heggie's played in 17. Buchanan's played in 15. Chris Blake played in 4, but still was able to redshirt last year. Richard Garage, who's the guy you're sort of alluding to, played in 2 games last year. And then Gene DeLance played in 6. And Noah Banks, who's now going to be a senior, played in 12 last year. So there's quite a bit of actual game experience, of 71 total games amongst those 7 guys. And then, so if they can all be effective and sort of be interchangeable parts, then you might be able to sustain an injury. But no, I mean, to me, the guy I'm really looking at this year, especially early on, is Richard Garage. I think, he was a high level recruit 2 years ago, was able to redshirt last year, but now he's had an entire year in Hevesy's system and Mullen's system and in Savage's strength and conditioning system. And, he was a high level 4-star guy, the 81st ranked overall recruit. Mullen hasn't necessarily brought in a whole lot of guys who are ranked higher than him. And so if you're going to do that, you need those guys who are rated in the top 100 to deliver. And, this is really a year where you've got, there are some open spots that Garage should be able to step into. And so I'm looking to see whether he's able to take that next step and really earn that job in fall camp.
Yeah, that's really what it is. If he can take that next step. And I think when we were kind of forecasting, after last season ended, who would maybe be out, who would be out there through spring practice, and when we go and when Florida goes against Miami. And I think, because of Garrard's recruiting pedigree, I think he got thrown in there. But Stone Forsyth really kind of went through spring and kind of just seemed the guy who just kind of just steady there. And I think Will, and we'll get to your article here that was well received out there and talking about this offensive line. It's again, I think the thought has to become now: is this offensive line serviceable? Can they be more than serviceable? How fast does it take to grow? How fast does it take to come together? How fast does it come for those guys to gel together? And I've said this before on the podcast, and talking about these guys here. It's how beneficial is it with them being with John Hevesy for 2 years? Last year, you had a lot of experience, but not a lot of experience in this offense. Not a lot of experience in Dan Mullen's offense. Not a lot of experience working with John Hevesy. You can call it experience in a way. Not a lot of experience working out with Nick Savage in the training room and all these summer workouts and winter workouts that they went through when Dan Mullen was first hired. I don't know if how we can measure that. You alluded to it that last year's offensive line was able to stay healthy, but now you have, as you know, we'll say it just for the sake of saying it, but 4 new starters. But like I said, you can kind of say 3 with the way you want to maybe categorize Brett Hagee here. But another year with Nick Savage, another year with John Hevesy, another year with Dan Mullen scheming. Maybe we do see this group of starting 5 offensive linemen and a couple, 2 or 3 reserves come together much faster than what we saw last year, just because of the experience that they got in year 1.
Yeah, well, I mean, last year you could see that the offensive line was a little bit overwhelmed, especially early on against Kentucky. By the time you got to the Florida State games and the Michigan game, that just wasn't true anymore. The offensive line was really communicating well, playing well, and was picking up stunts and all sorts of other things that you would expect from an offensive line that both has experience but also has been coached throughout the year. So you expect to see that a little bit as the season goes on. And I would expect there to be some, for there to be a little bit of a learning curve, that there are going to be some mistakes made. And, one of the things I think that we're going to get into as the offseason progresses is Miami had a pretty solid defense last year. In fact, a really good defense last year and a pretty good defensive front. And so, is the Florida offensive line going to be able to hold up early on? That's going to be one of the questions. But, there are ways to scheme around that. There are ways to take the pressure off your offensive line. Mullen and Hevesy aren't stupid. They're going to know where their holes are, and they're going to try to figure out how to cover those up. And the other thing is I think, last year, those guys, Ivy obviously had a pretty high pedigree, but still didn't end up drafted in the NFL. And then you got Jawan Taylor on the other side. He sort of reverted back to his 2016 form. So it's not as if he wasn't talented enough. I mean, obviously a first round draft pick, but we're not talking about a considerably more talented offensive line. I mean, the offensive line last year averaged 3.4 stars and an 87.6 rating. The offensive line this year, if you've got Garage in there, averages a 3.2 with an 87.4 rating. So from a talent perspective, these guys are right on par with where they were last year. I think it's a little bit more evenly distributed throughout the line. I mean, last year, Ivy was really the guy sort of propping up all those ratings. And this year, they're replacing with more talented players, but with more inexperience. And so, but this is what happens in college football, right? I mean, in college football, and we're going to be going through this next offseason where we're talking about the wide receivers, where all the wide receivers are leaving. Where are they going to find production, especially if Kadarius Toney has a big year and he decides to go pro? Well, now all of a sudden, you don't have anybody coming back at the wide receiver position. And, guys like RJ Henderson and Jacob Copeland and all those guys are going to have to step up. And we're going to say, we haven't seen it yet, but these guys have a pedigree. I think it's sort of the same thing with the offensive line this year.
Yeah, I've put it together that they probably have to replace at least 5 receivers, if with Toney probably 6. And all that maybe with starting a brand new quarterback as well for Felipe Franks leave. So the passing game we'll have plenty of time to get to it. But yeah, it's kind of the I don't know why it took me so long to kind of pair those together. But yeah, you could be looking at Emory Jones and a slew of new receivers. Hey, but with a more experienced offensive line next year.
And that's sort of my point, right? That it's rare to get to the point where you've and Alabama's gotten to this point, Clemson has gotten to this point.
Before we go right there, Will, Georgia's going to be looking at the same situation next year. If Jake Fromm leaves, and they're probably losing 4 or 5, offensive linemen after this year, they could be looking a lot like Florida going into this coming year, where they have to replace 4 out of 5 offensive linemen and a quarterback if Jake Fromm decides to go pro.
Absolutely. But I mean, that's kind of my point, right? Is that in college football, you're always going to be replacing somebody, and you'd like to have it be balanced, right? I mean, you'd like to have a couple of juniors and maybe a sophomore and a couple of true freshmen or something playing, or a couple of redshirt freshmen playing on your offensive line. That's just not the case right now. They're not going to be able to do that. And so, next year, there will be an experienced offensive line on the field, but there are going to be other areas on the field where guys have left, and they're going to have to fill in those holes too. I mean, the reality is just over a 4 or 5 year period, you're always going to have holes to fill. That's why you recruit. It's why we harp on recruiting so much. And it's why it's so important, right? That you have to have guys who can step in, high level guys who can play when they're true freshmen. And, again, I think the other thing that we're sort of discounting here a little bit with the offensive line, or maybe don't have any way of gauging, is all the guys who are coming in as true freshmen who have, I mean, the offensive line recruiting this past year for Florida was excellent. A lot of blue chip guys, a lot of top level guys coming in on the offensive line, and if those guys pan out or if they show flashes, even if they're a little bit inconsistent, if they can pick up the system pretty quickly, then they may contribute as well. So, I'm a little bit more bullish on the offensive line than maybe most people are. I tend not to worry about the on-field performance from the guys that Mullen gets. I think he's got a pretty good track record. Hevesy as well has a pretty good track record that they're going to be successful. Again, I think there will be some growing pains. And you sort of say, okay, where's my baseline start from? But we would have said the same thing last year looking at that offensive line. It's like we had no idea what to expect. And I remember Cole Kubelik was predicting Florida was going to have the best offensive line in the conference 2 years in 2017. The offensive line was terrible. And so then nobody really expected anything from them in 2018. They were pretty decent. So
maybe Cole was a year just ahead of schedule. Maybe he saw the baseline talent and it just never came to fruition.
He's the one who probably called in the death threats and got rid of McElwain. That's a joke. It's a joke. But yeah, so I think everybody saw the talent on the offensive line. I think it's the same thing this year. I think plenty of people are will have seen the talent. The question is, can they stay healthy? Can they maintain continuity? That's a big thing last year. I mean, when you looked at the tape of the Michigan game, those guys were playing as one unit rather than playing as individuals. I think when you look at the tape of the Kentucky game, they were playing more as individuals than they were as a unit. And that's sort of what you're going to have to build over the course of hopefully spring camp. They've already initiated that. But then in fall camp, they'll be able to really gel together because it's not Charleston Southern coming up week 1 this year.
That's right. And I will get to a skill player right here that Will and I both like before we get into Will's article, because all this kind of comes together with the skill players and the offensive line. But Will had some really good numbers for what happened at Florida this past year and what happened at Mississippi State this past year as well. We're looking at Dan Mullen and John Hevesy there. So, Will, the skill player that I want to bring up that is key for me, I know you and I have talked behind the scenes about him a little bit more. One running back in Malik Davis. And I still think he is the player that can be a difference maker, playmaker at running back if he's still able to be the type of player that we saw in 2017. And let's go back and look at what he brought to the table in 2017 before being injured versus Georgia that season. Played in 7 games, starting 2 before suffering season-ending injury against Georgia. He ranked second on the team in rushing, totaling 526 yards on 79 carries and 2 touchdowns. Despite the injury, ranks 4th in Florida's history for most net rushing yards by a true freshman since 1996. This is behind Ernest Graham, Jeff Demps, Deshaun Wynn. Recorded 5 games with 90-plus yards, including career-high 124 against Vanderbilt. He also became the first true freshman in Florida history to rush for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns in a game since Jeff Demps did so against Arkansas. Overall, he became the 17th Florida true freshman since 1955 to rush for over 100 yards in a game. He ranked 3rd in the SEC for most net rushing yards by a true freshman. And then he was named to the coach's freshman all-SEC team year that year, Will. So only playing in 7 games, of course, he was needed after Jordan Scarlett was not able to play in 2017. Came in as a true freshman, was behind LaMichael Pirine. After only 7 games, was still named to the coach's freshman all-SEC team. So all this after only playing in 7 games. He averaged 6.7 yards per carry in 2017 behind an offensive line that did him no favors whatsoever. We all remember the type of season LaMichael Pirine had last year in 2018, but his 2017 numbers don't compare to what Davis was bringing to the table as far as yards per carry go. Pirine averaged 4.1 yards in the 2017 season compared to Davis's 6.7. Pirine showed how much he could improve behind an improved offensive line and better scheme, and raised his yards per carry average up to 6.2 last year. So 2-yard difference for LaMichael Pirine from 2017 to 2018. So I'm ready to see Malik Davis get that chance too. We saw Pirine bust long runs toward the end of last season, but Davis still has that extra gear, that top-end speed that I'm not so sure the other running backs bring to the table. And look, in no means, I don't want anybody to get this confused, I am not calling him Percy Harvin by any means. But in both their junior seasons, they have a similar build. 5'11", Davis is at 5'11", 191. Percy was 5'11", 195. Percy with a faster 40-time clock with a 4.35. Davis ticked slower, 4.43. But the reason I bring all this up is Davis isn't Yeah, he isn't the all around, all purpose type Percy Harvin but I think we'll see Davis in the similar style runs Percy was used in the backfield. You know, the counter, the pitches, the sweeps, the speed option, all those types of runs to test the edges, use straight line speed bursts to get big gains, difference making runs. So, like I said, we saw P. Ryan get those types of runs late last season, but I still think Davis is that guy that consistently get those types of big plays as long as he's healthy and can stay on the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll know early on, right? I mean, so 2 years ago, he averaged 6.7 yards per carry on 79 carries. Last year, he only had 13 carries before he got injured, but he only averaged 4.7 yards per rush. Now, that's not really unusual when you have somebody coming off of an injury. So, I mean, if you look at Nick Chubb in 2015, I mean, he was averaging 8.1 yards per carry, had that horrible knee injury, and came back and averaged 5 the year after. And then in his senior year, when he was splitting carries with DeAndre Swift, averaged 6 yards a carry. So I would still say that the explosiveness of Chubb was less in his senior year than it was his freshman and his sophomore year before he got injured. And the question is just going to be, how much explosiveness does Malik Davis have? As far as the Percy Harvin role, you know, I understand what you're saying in terms of getting him on the edge and sort of some of those option plays where they're really trying to get somebody on the edge, using him in that capacity. The difference is that when you optioned Percy Harvin into the backfield, you now had him on a linebacker basically, and
Yeah.
and you don't necessarily, like, I don't know that by having the personnel out there where he's a wide receiver and he's out wide, and then you motion him into the backfield, it gives you some schematic advantages that if Malik Davis isn't capable of doing that sort of stuff on the outside, you don't get that schematic advantage just from the 11 guys that the defense puts on the field. But at the same time, if you're running a 4-4 out there and you're able to make guys miss an open space, I mean, you know, there were some plays last year against LSU where P. Ryan, you know, busted maybe a 20, 25-yard run, and you wonder whether that one goes 80. And we've talked a lot this offseason about Florida not necessarily having a guy who can take it to the house and make people miss, even in a situation where maybe, you know, he gets stopped for a 5-yard gain or the guy busts it for 40. And how often has Florida had a player who's been able to bust it for 40? Tony's really the only one who comes to mind. He hasn't really taken it to the house that much when he's had the opportunity. I mean, he's turned sort of 2-yard gains into 12, but he hasn't turned 12 into 50. So if Malik Davis can do that, then obviously he's going to find his way out onto the field. And I think a lot of it hinges on how healthy is he, and has the extra year off basically because of the foot injury given him time to recover from the knee injury, and is he going to be as explosive as he was before?
I think that is the biggest question. If he still has that explosiveness, then I think there's an arsenal in the backfield of Florida. You know, even with Jordan Scarlett and Michael P. Ryan together last year, to still, you know, they're more of the. And that's another thing about the offensive line, and we'll get here too. They really help these running backs not get tackled for losses. You know, they were always getting positive yardage, and those running backs were good at getting positive yardage, but not necessarily busting the big play. Like I said, like Michael P. Ryan busted a couple toward the end of the season, but not sure we get that consistency there. Like I think we can get from Davis as far as big play ability goes. So, we discussed a couple of key offensive line men and a running back that will have to run behind those big men. P. Ryan had the luxury of running behind an experienced offensive line last season, and all of that, just brought up about Davis being a key player also depends on how well this new offensive line comes together. And you released a great look into this new look offensive line, and maybe we shouldn't be as worried about the offensive line because of Mullen and Hevesey's history and the vast improvement the Gators offensive line made last season.
Yeah, I mean, everybody saw that Florida improved last year on the offensive line. I think it was pretty obvious to anyone who was watching and anybody who had watched from last year. I mean, you mentioned P. Ryan, I think, went from averaging something like 4.8 or 4.7 yards per rush to averaging up over 6 last year. And that can't just be P. Ryan, right? I mean, you don't typically see that kind of leap from one year to the next, especially because the 2 previous years he'd sort of had the same yards per rush. Now, certainly, I'm sure he got stronger under Savage, and he was given more time to sort of get into a rhythm. But at the same time, you attribute some of that to the offensive line, and in fact, it bears out when you start looking at the stats. So, Football Outsiders has some really good stats, both from a running perspective and from a passing perspective. And if you look at last year on the running stats, basically every single stat if you take 2015 through 2017, so the McElwain Nussmeier regime or reign of terror, whatever you want to call it, and compare it to 2018 on the ground, Florida was 55 times better in a stat called line yards, which basically is how much yardage did the offensive line earn versus how much did the running back earn. Really the only thing that they were close to the McElwain Nussmeier regime was power success rate, which is short yardage. So in short yardage, they weren't much better. They were about middle of the pack, but everywhere else, 12th in line yards, 13th in standard down line yards, 27th in pass down line yards, 17th in opposition rate. So, basically when it came to the running game, everything improved from the McElwain regime to the Mullen regime. And the same thing applied when it came to passing. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Felipe Franks played a lot better and he wasn't on his back very often. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that when he got pressured, that was when the interceptions came. So the one that jumps to mind is the one against LSU where he had just thrown a beautiful pass to open up the second half. And then the next pass is a little floater to Delpit in the end zone after he got pressured, hit right in the ribs. And, the offensive line didn't hold up its end of the bargain on that particular play. And when a quarterback gets pressured, they tend to make bad decisions, especially young quarterbacks. And I think we still would have categorized Franks as a young quarterback last year against LSU. But the other thing is that there was an interesting thought experiment here, which is that Mullen had 5 starters on his last year at Mississippi State, and only one of those guys left between 2017 and 2018. And so you can look at the Mississippi State stats and say, well, how were they under Mullen? And then how were they last year under Joe Moorhead? And the opposite is true, right? So in the running game, they weren't much different. There were a few things, in particular, the power running that got worse for Mississippi State last year. But for the most part, the running stats were kind of a wash. But when you looked at the pass stats, they were 92 spots worse in sack rate. They were 92 spots worse in sack rate on standard downs, and they were 66 spots worse on sack rate for passing downs. So, this offensive guru chucking the ball all over the place, Joe Moorhead up at Mississippi State, and all of a sudden the exact same guys on the offensive line couldn't block in passing situations, whereas the year before they could. And I think a lot of that has to go to Hevesy and Mullen, that they have both technique and schematic things that really hide warts that the offensive line has. And if you look at what the Mississippi State offensive line was able to do over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been pretty consistent that they've been a top tier offensive line. And, these are with guys that are in that 3-star range. They haven't had a whole lot of 5-star guys on that offensive line. And so, we talk about recruiting, we talk about how it's important, but this is where development is important too. And Mississippi State's had a really good offensive line. And in particular, when you figure who have they been playing against, right? I mean, they've been playing against Auburn, LSU, Alabama. Even Ole Miss has been pretty good in that time period. And those are defenses that really get after the quarterback. And to have offensive lines that are holding up their end of the bargain, I think is a pretty good indicator that we should be pretty confident that Florida's offensive line is not going to be the weak link this year. And that doesn't mean they won't make mistakes from time to time, but they're not going to be the weak link. And that if there is a weak link on the line, that Mullen is going to find a way to scheme around it.
Well, and I think the perfect example of that is the Mississippi State game on both sides. When Florida traveled to Starkville and played Mississippi State, we thought that if people go and read Will's article, there's plenty of times. And look, we discussed it going into the Mississippi State game last year, and it was the storyline of the game where Florida helping their offensive line by getting the screens out there, quick throw game from Felipe Franks, getting the ball to the receivers behind the line of scrimmage, getting the ball in Felipe Franks' hands, making the job easy for the offensive lineman, and then reverse that to the other side and talk about Hevesy and Mullen leaving Mississippi State and how their offensive line gave up so many sacks. They gave up 6 sacks against Florida last year. So talking just going to Will's stat there about how worse Mississippi State's offensive line got by pass protection. The prime example for both ends of the spectrum of offensive line under John Hevesy and Dan Mullen was the Mississippi State game.
Yeah, the interesting thing is when you really look at the film, it looks as though Mullen uses the running game to protect his offensive line in the passing game. That having Franks as a threat back there to run opened some things up. There was a play I diagrammed in the Michigan game where the middle linebacker was spying Felipe Franks in the red zone. And it's like,
Repeat that. Repeat that, Will.
the middle linebacker for Michigan was spying Felipe Franks in the red zone, and it opened things up. In fact, it made it to where the offensive line got to block 5-on-5 rather than 5-on-6, and the linebacker just kind of stood there in the middle of the field. And his responsibility was to account for Franks, because Franks had hurt them running earlier in the game. And my favorite set of plays actually was, if you went back and looked at the Kentucky game. I think people remember the option play that they ran to Pirine pretty successfully against LSU. Well, that play was present against Kentucky, but they kept running it to the strong side, and that opened up that made it difficult for the left tackle to get out and make the block that he needed to do. So the next week or 2 weeks later against Mississippi State, they ran it to the weak side, and it allowed Jawan Taylor to do what he does best on the outside. But the other thing that it did was it really sort of took the choice. Like, it became very clear for Franks what he was supposed to do. And the defensive end, because of the way he was sort of situated, had to take Franks and get him to give up the ball. And when he did, the running back got around the corner. So it's a small detail, but running it to the short side of the field, to the weak side of the formation, is not something you would necessarily expect for an option play. But they made that change, and it opened things up, and really sort of, and in some capacity played to the strengths of their offensive line, but also played to the strengths of their quarterback and what they wanted him to do, because they didn't particularly want Franks running that option downfield unless he absolutely had to. And again, it's just a little thing, but making that little adjustment made a huge difference. The offensive line didn't have to block successfully on that play in many places. It was just at some point it was Franks reading the defensive end and then pitching it out to Pirine and letting him get around the corner, and that was successful against Mississippi State. It was successful against LSU, and is sort of one of those adjustments that Mullen is able to make his offensive line look better than maybe it is.
All right, everybody. So it was a hot topic on Twitter today. Will's article on the Florida offensive line and the improvement they made last year, and maybe why it's not so big of a worry for the 2019 season. So I recommend everybody go there and read it. Like I said, Will's got the examples of certain plays he's talking about to kind of show improvement of the offensive line and scheming and coaching from John Hevesy and Dan Mullen. So highly recommend it. Read and reaction. .com. So, Will, a couple more key players that we're going to look at for the defensive side of the ball. And I'm going to lead it off here with Marco Wilson. I think we saw how key Marco Wilson was last season. And while Trey Dean filled in admirably, Wilson gives you two lockdown corners on the field when paired with C.J. Henderson. Now, much like Malik Davis, all this is determined just how healthy and how quick and he can bounce back from the knee injury. But all reports are great there. We already know how blitz happy and disruptive Todd Grantham can be with his scheme. Well, just imagine when you have two lockdown corners on the field, and Pro Football Focus put out a stat last week where C.J. Henderson only allowed 18 catches on 343 coverage snaps last season and gave up 0 touchdowns. 0 touchdowns given up by C.J. Henderson last year. So you would have to think that Marco Wilson would improve on his 2017 season. There where he joined Joe Hayden and the likes of Joe Hayden, Janoris Jenkins, and Marcus Robeson as the only 4 true freshmen to start at cornerback on opening day for the Gators there. And Marco Wilson started all 11 games throughout the season in 2017, 34 tackles, team high 10 pass breakups. And those 10 breakups were the most by a true freshman in Florida's history since Vernon Hargraves recorded 11 in 2013. So adding Marco back in the fold allows Grantham to stay creative in the front seven, keep Trey Dean in that nickel star spot, keeps them from forcing Kyer Elam from being thrusted onto the field. And not saying he can't be ready or won't be ready, but at this point in time, he'd be no Marco Wilson at this point. So Wilson returning 100% is key for me in this entire defense. Really, it helps up front. And in the back end as well, where Florida would have their best 3 defensive backs on the field at the same time with Wilson, Henderson, and Dean back there.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You mentioned the 10 pass defense, the 10 pass breakups. I mean, what that kind of indicates is people were avoiding C.J. Henderson even early on and chucking it in Wilson's direction, and was certainly holding up over there. He also had, I think, 34 tackles 2 years ago. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not as if he wasn't able to mix it up and sort of play some of those bubble screens and get into the backfield a little bit as well. And we saw that last year a little bit with C.J. Henderson blitzing off the edge every once in a while in
Yeah.
key situations. And if Wilson shows that ability, then you can come from either side. And that's not, I don't recall seeing a blitz from Trey Dean coming from the other side. It was really C.J. Henderson coming on those blitzes. And so you wonder whether maybe Grantham can be a little bit more multiple in terms of where he's coming from based on who he has out there. But I think you mentioned you've obviously got Huggins out there who showed some stuff during the
Mm-hmm.
spring practice. But you want Trey Dean to be the star, right? I mean, you want him to be at that star position. You want him to be more in the slot. I think it takes advantage of some of the skills that he shoot. He was recruited originally as a safety. Takes advantage of some of those skills that he has as opposed to necessarily putting him on an island on the outside. But yeah, I mean, Wilson was a really, really good player when he went down with that injury and was a really good player 2 years ago. And if he can recover to being the same type of player, then I think Florida's got a really solid backside of the defense. But again, I'll go back to what I said about Malik Davis, which is that sometimes these injuries take more than a full year to get your explosion back. I suppose if you're going to say the good news associated with that is that Wilson's injury happened pretty early in the year, so it hasn't. It's not as if it happened in the Michigan game and he's coming back 8 months afterwards. It happened in the Kentucky game, and so it will have been a full year. So hopefully he's able to recover fully, has that explosiveness, and can really make a difference on the outside.
Well, I always go back to, I think, one of the first times you were on Gators Breakdown, you talk about how key it is to be strong up front, and the depth up front, and that's kind of where your key player on defense leads the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you really want to look at so I think a lot of people are concerned about Florida's offensive line. I'd be a little bit concerned about their defensive line. I just think, with the guys they've lost, I mean, Jordan Sherritt from a couple of years ago, and they've lost other, CC Jefferson is gone now, and you lose, you lose Polite off the defensive line as well. The question is who's going to step into that space and who's going to, and then you've also got Amari Burney stepping in at linebacker, and all reports are that he's flying all over the place, but it's hard to fly all over the place when you've got an offensive lineman on your, on your shoulder pads. And so, the defensive tackles are going to be really key. And Slayton is the guy again, at high level, talented guy who came in. You need those guys to deliver when you don't bring in a ton of them, and Florida hasn't necessarily brought in a ton of defensive tackle. Now, last year he had 21 tackles and 1.5 tackles for loss, whereas the year before he had 11 total tackles and 1.5 tackles for loss. So it's not as if he's putting up huge stats, but sacks and tackles for loss are sort of they're not stats you necessarily look at for a defensive tackle and say, is he doing a good job or is he not doing a good job, especially in a 3-4 defense. And you do wonder, now that he's in his second year with Grantham's defense, sort of understands what he needs to do, is he going to be effective basically at occupying 2 offensive linemen? I mean, if you look at offensive line play, those offensive linemen wanted to combo block the guys on the inside, right? You want 2 offensive linemen to hit that defensive tackle and then one of them to get out to a linebacker. And when he gets out to a linebacker, then the running back has a cutback lane. And, if Slayton can occupy those 2 guys up front, and he's really the guy who's got the overall physical talent to be able to do that, if he can occupy those 2 guys up front, then Burney and David Reese can just sort of fly around back there and make all the tackles. And, we talked a lot last year about linebackers not being in the right gap. Well, this year, if the linebackers are in the right gap and Slayton can occupy guys up front, then Florida's going to have a really effective defense because you're not going to be able to run on them with the speed that the linebackers have. So, Slayton playing well up front, or really any defensive tackle playing well up front, is going to open up what those linebackers can do. And so I think you probably won't see it in terms of like tackles for loss and sacks in terms of Slayton.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you might see it is, 14 tackles for Amari Burney in a big game. And some of that will be due to Slayton being up there up front, and Elijah Conliffe as well being up there up front to occupy blockers and letting those linebackers roam.
Yeah, I think the question there is, you're pretty happy with what you think you're going to get from Jonathan Grenard, the transfer there, and Jabari Zuniga, who really came on last season, paired with Jakai Polite. So if you can get that same kind of pairing with Polite and Zuniga, or with Grenard and Zuniga, then you go to tackle in there. You hope maybe what we're saying with behind those guys at linebacker and edge rusher, you not necessarily concentrate just on the defensive tackles on that line, where they probably can go four deep. And another positive there, I think, with Schuler and Kyrie Campbell coming along last year when Slayton and Conliffe kind of proved that they couldn't get it done early on in the season. If those guys do step up, it gives you a pretty good four-man rotation, and where you can go with Schuler, Campbell, Slayton, Conliffe, and keep those guys fresh, keep them healthy, and hopefully bring in some versatility with the guys probably bring some different things to the field, some different qualities. Schuler, I think, brings some quickness there, but some other guys, Slayton and Conliffe, some quickness and some strength. Kyrie Campbell, a bit kind of bigger type there, really strong type of guy. So you're getting kind of different type of players with the four guys Florida can bring along the defensive tackle spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rotation is what's important in terms of what you said there, right? Is that inevitably in an SEC game, you're going to have a guy who gets nicked, or you're going to have a point where the defense is gassed and the defensive tackles, if they've been out there all game, are just going to give stuff up because they haven't been able to get a blow. And so Slayton doesn't even really need to be, and Conliffe don't even really need to be starters. They need to be difference makers when they go out there to supplement the stuff that Schuler and Campbell did last year. And I don't want to shortchange those guys because they did a very good job last year. In particular, in the Tennessee game, I remember Schuler really sort of announcing his presence as a transfer and looking at that saying, oh well, that guy earned the job apparently during practice because he's playing really well during the game. But again, you're not going to get through the SEC schedule, and you're not going to get through a game with Georgia or a game with LSU with two defensive tackles. You're going to have to rotate people in there. And so having Slayton and Conliffe step into that role, I think is going to be important. Otherwise, your linebackers are going to get drilled and you're going to give up some runs, and you're going to wonder, why did somebody get gashed there? It's like, well, it's because an offensive lineman got on a linebacker. And that's not something you necessarily see when you're watching it live if you're not looking for it. But, typically those defensive tackles, especially in the 3-4 schemes, are really important just to occupy those blockers up front.
All right, we'll get into some of the listener thoughts on key players, but before we do, Will, Gator Kicks, boom, has a new release. There, got them in the mail today. The new release, Dan Mullen Media Day 4s is what they're calling them. They'll be available tomorrow, Tuesday, at thegatorkicks.com. You may have seen the Gator-inspired Jordan 4s a couple of weeks ago, but these sample remakes pay homage to the ones Dan Mullen wore last year at SEC Media Days there. So head to thegatorkicks.com where you can also request additional customization to these shoes there. So that's thegatorkicks.com there, orange and blue, white with the Jordan logo there. Those guys at Gator Kicks do great work. And Will, have you broken in your the Jordans they sent you in a couple weeks ago?
I have, and they fit, so that's great. I was afraid they weren't going to be big enough, but hey, they're working out well, and appreciate that. And certainly, I've been to their site and looked at the customization stuff they do there. That's pretty cool too. So people should check that out.
Absolutely. All right. So I mentioned you guys have sent in some of your key players that you're expecting big things from, or just some key players that will play important roles here for the Gators in the 2019 season. We'll start off with Lucas Mann here saying Franks and the entire offensive line. This team will go as far as Franks and the offensive line takes it. If we can just get average offensive line play, I can see 11 wins, including a bowl win. But the O-line is bad, 6 wins there. So kind of along the same lines. C3, good friend C3 here, says Gene Lance. So this guy will emerge as right tackle and will be a key piece moving on to 2020. Clint Lawrence says Bernie at linebacker. He's going to shine, Dave. And a lot of talk there, kind of just discuss how important the defensive line is in relation to the linebacker core. Bernie stepping in for Sean Joseph and seeing a type of playmaker there. He can be Michael Pfeffer there from joined us here a couple weeks ago on Chomp Talk, right, Will?
Yep,
there. So he says Trey Dean, he will have some big shoes to fill at the star position, but if he comes into his own, he will wreak havoc on opposing offenses the way that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson did. And that is one player, Will, Trey Dean stepping in for star, and the kind of the freelancing Chauncey Gardner-Johnson could do at times, and the big playmaking ability. remains to be seen if Trey Dean can be that type of playmaker. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson really excelled in that role, really bounced back from 2017, and we saw it all in its glory in the bowl game against Michigan with 2 picks and 1 return for a pick 6. I don't know if we'll get that type of playmaking ability, but I'm not even necessarily looking at big play interceptions that Trey Dean can he blitz? Can he get back there to the quarterback? Can he tackle a running back on a swing pass? Can he get back to the wide receiver that's catching a wide receiver screen? Because Chauncey Gardner-Johnson would bust through would-be blockers and go make a tackle behind the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dean's shown that capability, at least, just based on his high school tape and different things like that, but wasn't asked to do it very much last year. And so, it's one of those things. Same thing with the offensive lineman, right? You don't know it until you've seen it, but you suspect, or at least I suspect, that if he was able to move from inside to outside relatively smoothly last year, that experience on the outside, getting the cover experience, is only going to help him when he moves back inside. And so, if you've got a lockdown guy in the slot who's a little bit bigger than maybe your traditional corner, who can go in there and make a tackle from time to time, it's going to be a successful part of your defense. And Mullen and Grantham have talked about this, having guys who are versatile, who can move inside and outside, and certainly Dean's shown his ability to do that thus far.
All right, let's see the name at Riverside Lax 39 says Kyle Pitts. He's a complete mismatch for almost anyone, especially since he'll be most likely lined up against linebackers or third best cornerback. I think he makes a lot of plays in clutch situations. Stats may not be crazy like Jefferson or Grimes, but a lot of key third down plays and in zone touchdowns. Another thing about Kyle Pitts, a player I go back to, and I was comparing Jaheim Bell, a current commit from Valdosta that the Gators have, to Cornelius Ingram, but maybe Kyle Pitts is also kind of used in that similar role back that we saw Cornelius Ingram was able to do back over Myers head coach 2007, that year where Ingram really showed out there. But maybe that type of role for Pitts, and we saw the creativity on offense last year from the tight end position a good bit, involving some trick plays as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the key question for any of these guys at tight end is going to be, how do they block? Because if you've got a guy who can block and dictate that they have to have a linebacker in for him when he's situated near the line of scrimmage, then you can split him out. And this is really, Rob Gronkowski for the Patriots was a fantastic route runner and really, really good when he got out there. But one of the reasons was he was always getting guarded by a linebacker, because they had to keep a linebacker in because he was such a good blocker up front. And that combination is special. I'm not comparing anybody to Gronkowski, but what it is, one of the reasons why the Patriots always had a matchup advantage is because the tight end could block and could go out and catch the ball. And Pitts last year, they split him out wide a lot like a wide receiver. He was able to use his body to make some catches maybe that a wide receiver might not be able to do. Certainly that's a valuable thing, but I think really the significance of any of these tight ends' value is going to be tied into how can they block. Because if you have to have a blocking tight end, and then you have to have a pass catching tight end, well, then the defense kind of knows what's coming, or at least they can put a nickel back on the field when you've got your pass catching tight end in. So that's kind of what I'd be looking for Pitts. Not necessarily what's he doing when he's split outside. It's what's he doing when he's inside and he's blocking.
A few more here. Casey Hampton says Amari Burney, he could play to the level of elite and fill the leadership gap with Chauncey leaving. He could be the linchpin of the defense if he plays to the level we need him to, and know he can. Gator Lyle Saunders, he might have got a quick preview of the episode somehow. We don't know how he did this, but he says probably Brett Heggie anchoring and leading the offensive line on defense. I say as a group of defensive tackles, and whoever ends up playing the star positions. So he kind of went the route that we went with the some of the players there with Heggie, defensive tackle, and the star position, and kind of along the same lines as Gator George UF. He says Marco, in his absence last year, meant an unbalanced secondary. Having 2 NFL caliber cornerbacks this year could make the difference when we're back in Jacksonville.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we've pretty much named every guy in the field at this point, I think. And I mean, and that's the reality, right? Is that you have to have, Franks can't take a step back. P. Ryan has
Yep.
to be just as effective. Malik Davis has to come out and prove that he can stay healthy. Same with Brett Heggie. Buchanan has to play the same way he did last year. We need a right tackle to step into the spot left by Jawan Taylor. We need a left tackle to step into the spot left by Martez Ivy. There's just and it's like this for every team right now, right? Every team during the offseason is looking and saying, hey, we have a hole here, we have a hole there. Where are we going to fill it? There are a few teams that probably feel more comfortable with filling those holes than others, but at the end of the day, I feel pretty comfortable with the names that we're throwing out there in terms of their ability to perform. Are they going to be all SEC guys? Maybe, maybe not, but are they going to be competent starters on the field? I think definitely they will be.
Derek Barfield, Will Miles says there is never any answer except Tommy Townsend. And not to be overlooked. I mean, Florida returns two specialists, and I think they get overlooked right now because they're pretty given. They're given as a reliable, specialist out there. Evan McPherson, very consistent field goal kicker and can kick it from distance as well. And Townsend out there kicking punts. There's not really a worry about those guys. Before Eddie Pinheiro, it seemed like we were discussing field goal kicking week in and week out, costing the Gators here or there, and how those tight games would always come down to there. But the last two waves of Florida kickers and punters, not a lot to worry about there, Will.
Yeah, I certainly don't take the place kickers for granted.
Yeah.
With the dental student coming in for the Georgia game or whatever it was, and being fearful to kick extra points and all those sorts of things. But I think from a punting perspective, it feels like even going back to Eric Wilbur and some of those guys, the punting has always been fantastic at Florida. So, it is something that we take for granted that these guys are so good and that you go from Johnny to Tommy. And I like that Tommy's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, but, maybe not spearing people wants to be good. But, I think it's always fun to see the fact that a fake can come because it's pretty clear that Tommy Townsend has some athletic ability is kind of exciting. Just, it really sort of changed I would say the Vanderbilt game. That fake sort of set Florida on the path to come back from being behind there. So, special teams are always going to play a role, especially in close games. It's one of the things we saw last year. Florida was pretty good in one-score games. They were very good against top 25 teams, and a lot of that has to do with field position and where you're able to pin your opponent.
All right, last few here. The one lengthy one as well for those guys who sent them in here. Brian Wetzel says he's got to go with P. Ryan. He will be the bell cow of this offense and get the critical first downs while the offensive line still getting up to speed. Brian at BTH0025 says Stone Forsyth got to protect that blind side. Brent Pope says on offense, Stone Forsyth because Franks has to be able to trust his offensive line. And on defense, Jabari Zuniga as the heir apparent to Ja'Kai Polite because we need to make the opposing quarterback scared. And Jake Afrons had a lengthy post, but really good one here on safety Brad Stewart being a key player here. There, he goes, I'm not sure any Gator had a more memorable moment last year than Brad Stewart had with his pick six versus LSU. Brad had other memorable plays, the acrobatic pick versus Tennessee, but had a tough time staying on the field due to what was rumored to be some of the off-field issues. We have all seen the potential this guy has. He's fast, instinctive, and has an attitude, confidence to him that you like to see in a defensive back, something that I don't think can be matched by other guys in the safety group. He has the ability to play that deep safety eraser role and fly around in the defensive backfield, allowing our stud cornerbacks to be physical at the line of scrimmage and likely Jawan Taylor creep into the box for added run support, thus allowing our front seven to focus more on getting to the quarterback. If Stewart can stay out of trouble and prove to his coaches and teammates that he can be reliable, he can let his talent shine and add even more athleticism and swagger to a defensive back unit that should be able to shut down almost any passing game they see this year. I think Stewart has the ability to be a breakout all-SEC type. If he can stay out of the doghouse, he can add the final touch to a defense that should be top 10 this season. So a really good post there that he shared that he made on Gator Country, and really made a compelling point there for Brad Stewart to be a pretty key player. Will.
Yeah, we've obviously seen flashes.
Yeah.
At the same time, you do wonder. I mean, I sort of think of it as like the same thing on offense, where Mullins made some comments about Kadarius Toney freelancing and how that's limited the amount of time he's been on the field. And maybe it's not necessarily the on-field stuff, but how hard do you work in practice, and do you put the study in, and all those sorts of things? And those aren't things that we necessarily are privy to. But there's a reason Stewart hasn't been on the field as much, and it's probably not talent, but part of, like, there is a talent to being where you're supposed to be, to knowing what you're supposed to do and being consistent. And the guys who've been back there, Donovan Steiner and Quincy Linton and some of those guys have proven that they have the capability of doing that. So again, I think it's sort of like the defensive line. I mean, ideally, you'd love to have a guy who can be back there at all times in the safety spot, and who can, and you see this with linebackers, right? Like, a lot of times in the NFL, you'll hear people talk about a 3-down linebacker, somebody who can be out there who can do stuff in coverage and then can also support the run, and so they can be out there for all 3 downs. I think safety maybe is even the same thing, where there might be guys who are a little bit better in run support, guys who are a little bit better, when they're playing a zone defense, guys who are a little bit better when they're playing man-to-man, and they may have to sort of rotate people in based on what Grantham's trying to do, based on the skill sets of their guys back there.
Last two thoughts here. Coley Townsend says, on offense, I'd say the entire receiver core. Nobody knows what the offensive line is going to be like. Receivers need to create separation right from the jump to give Frank somewhere to put the ball. He may not have very long to get rid of the ball. And Lance Carlson last here says, Marco Wilson on defense. Can't let our secondary get thin again. Antonio on offense got to draw the opposing defense attention there. So thanks to all those guys out there for sending their thoughts and on this topic of some key Gators that we can that everybody's excited to see and that will contribute in this 2019 season. So one more thing, Will, before a little fun topic here that kind of swung your way. You tweeted a couple of days ago, is it football season yet? Getting the house ready with my boy as your son is hanging the Florida Gator flag on the house. And it is a Florida Gator flag with the old school Albert kind of standing Gator with his arms out to the side, and then the big block F on his sweater. And there were some comments out there that it was discussing that was somebody's favorite Gator logo. So you and I got kind of talking behind the scenes. I think Nathan says that Albert logo is the best Gators logo. So you and I got kind of talking behind the scenes that it would be funny before we get here on this episode to discuss what our favorite Gator logo would be. So I'll let you start the wheel with that one.
Yeah, man. The funny part is I like the Albert logo, the old school Albert logo, but my favorite is just the old UF, the circle with the alligator in the state of Florida.
The Charlie Pale shield.
There you go. I love that one, man. Like, I've got hats with it on it. I do wood burning. I've got some of those sitting around my house, and to me, it's just, I don't know. It's what came on all the official documentation when I got accepted to the school and when I was applying and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of the first thing I think of when I think of the University of Florida. It's the thing that was on sort of all the engineering letterhead and all that sort of stuff. So beyond just the football program, there's a sentimental aspect of it, just as it being sort of the official school seal and those sorts of things. But I love that one, man. Just the Gator and the Florida sort of making the UF show up and pop. That's my favorite. And I'm old these days, Dave. Like, so the funny part is I love the script F in the middle of the field. I know they have to put the Gator there. I understand why they have to do it, but the F on the field is one of my favorite ones too. So, it just if it's something that was there when I was there, that's usually the kind of thing that I like.
Yeah, the logo you're talking about, the Charlie Pell UF logo. That's what I guess a lot of people refer it to as. That is the first logo I remember seeing growing up, and the old times when SEC teams used to play on TBS. Before TBS became more of a comedy channel. I remember Florida Georgia playing on TBS in the early 90s, and that Charlie Pell logo being kind of the logo that you saw. And hey, look, the Gator script on the side of the helmet is very identifiable, and know a lot of people are not going to agree with me, but I'm wearing the hat, and if you're watching the YouTube version, the white helmet behind me too, with the new slanted F. That is my favorite logo. Has been since they released it. I know it's not very popular. I know there's a big stink out there with the white helmets as well because Florida just seems to lose when they play in them. But if you think uniform has an outcome on a game, I'm sorry, I can't agree with you there. But the slant F, fast F, I think is what UF calls it, is my favorite Gator logo.
Yeah, man. It's funny. I think the white helmets look really sharp, and the speed helmet with the F that sort of has the metallic flakes in it is really really sharp. But there's something about when you turn on the game and they got the blue jersey on with the orange helmet. There is no other team that has that combination. I mean, maybe Boise State, but they usually wear a blue helmet with their
Yeah.
blue jersey, right? So there's no other team that has that, and I think there's value to when you turn on the game and you used to hear Vern on CBS, and you know that it's Florida because they've got that uniform on, especially when they're wearing the blue pants and the blue jersey with the orange helmet at night. I mean, that's and I like the Gator script a lot too. But I mean, I hear where you're coming from. And hell, if the recruits like the white helmets, wear
Yeah.
them every game. I don't care. But yeah, the funny part is that um, there are just so many logos for Florida,
Yeah.
many different ways that they branded themselves, and you look up Northwest in Tallahassee, and man, there are some ugly logos up there. So I mean, I like the garnet and gold colors. I think those are actually really pretty colors, but um, now they've gone like, what was that last year against Virginia Tech? Was it like
No, the
black?
black. Yeah.
Like, what were they thinking?
And
So
then when they did that rebrand a few years ago, and they came out and their helmets looked purple instead of garnet, and they had to get them all remade and stuff because it looked purple and gold. It was like, okay, that's kind of weird.
I
Uh,
mean, they had to get prepared for the. They wanted to look good when they had the 18 tackles for loss or whatever against Virginia Tech.
but you're right. In Florida, yeah, just the amount of logos, the Gator head, which is the most synonymous now, and then the Fast F. Those two logos kind of be the new modern way of moving forward with Gator sports and Gator logos and the jerseys and such. But still the script as the spinning helmet behind me shows off. The script. The script on the orange helmets is very identifiable and noticeable, and you're watching the Gators when you see that. But yeah, you got the Pale logo, the Standing Albert. Then they redid the Standing Albert when they had the Fast F come out in like the mid '90s as well. And yeah, there's the old block F. Yeah, there's if you're buying T-shirts and hats, you got plenty of options to choose from.
I'm just glad they sort of decided to experiment with the basketball team first, and then if people like it, they bring it over to the football team rather than the other way around. Because though I mean I don't know, they had sort of that swamp green a couple of years ago that they decided to break out, and that's probably my least favorite uniform combination. But hey, you know what, man? It's good. The house is decked out in it. It's definitely the type of stuff my parents get me every year when when they don't know what to get me for Christmas. And yeah, I'll take the Pell logo any day of the week, man.
All right, that's Will Miles' thoughts there on Gator logos and stuff. Well, you'll be out next week traveling, right?
Yeah, I'm actually going to Spain for work, so there'll
Gators
probably
Breakdown from Spain.
yeah, I doubt it. Now I'll probably post some things on Twitter from some old churches. I'm gonna go visit them over there. This is actually for work. This isn't for pleasure, but I'm sure we'll get away a little bit while we're over there and see some stuff. So yeah, I'm excited about the trip, but certainly ready to get back and talk more Florida once we do.
All right, so that's Will Miles. You can find his work at readandreaction.com. Really good article, as we alluded to earlier, on the Florida offensive line. And it may not be such a worry as it's kind of perceived out there right now. You can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.